everyone, and welcome to the All Creatures Podcast. I'm Angie, and today I'll be interviewing a very special guest talking about one of the most unique and mysterious animals in the world. I'll be interviewing Dr. Barny Long, which is the director from the Global Wildlife Conservation, where he acts as the Species Conservation Director. And this is a nonprofit organization out of Austin, Texas. And I'm having him on the podcast today as my guest expert in the Saola. Now, most of you are probably scratching your heads if you haven't listened to our species podcast on the Saola. The Saola is a unique mammal, hoofed and horned, my favorite. That's why I'm excited. Everybody knows that I love my hoof stock, out of Asia, and they're in a conservation crisis. And a lot of people don't know about them. So he's going to be here spreading the word today and teaching us all about the Saola and the great work that the Global Wildlife Conservation is doing, that he's also doing for Saola conservation. So good morning, Dr. Long. How are you?
Morning. I'm great, thank you. And it's fantastic to be here. Thanks for inviting me on.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Like I said, I've been wanting to have this interview so long, and I not only did I get an interview with a Saola expert, but I got an interview with a guy that's been working with them for close to 20 years almost?
Yep, nearly 20 years, yes.
Wow. Well, if you don't mind, can you give our listeners a little background about yourself and how you got to where you're at today as the director of Global Wildlife Conservation, Species Conservation?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Well, as far as I can remember, I always wanted to work in the rainforest, and I've got no idea where that dream came from. I come from inner city Leeds in the UK, and had absolutely zero exposure to rainforests or animals growing up. But it was a passion of mine since I was young. And I remember actually sitting in the library of my school when I was about 15 or 16, when the news of the discovery of the Saola broke. And I was reading BBC Wildlife magazine, which is the big kind of wildlife magazine in the UK. And I remember leaning over to my best friend and saying, "Hey, this is amazing. I want to work on this species."
Wow.
And it was about 4 or 5 years later where I applied for a job in Pumat National Park in northern Vietnam to establish a conservation program for the Saola. And I was completely unqualified. I was supposed to have 5 years experience and a master's degree and all of these kinds of things. But I was so keen that I applied anyway. And apparently everyone who'd worked in the park before had got really sick with dengue. So no one was applying for the job. And so they gave it to me. So in a very lucky turn of events, I got to start working on the Saola.
That's amazing. No one else could hack it. So you were.
Yeah. So I did get dengue and I did get sick for a couple of months, but it was worth it.
Wow. That is true dedication.
So I spent about 8 or 9 years in Vietnam, not just working on the Saola. I was working on primates and landscape scale conservation, and also did some work in Cambodia and Indonesia. And then moved to the US, and I've been here for over 10 years now. I moved over here for WWF, and I ran their species program in the US, and moved over to Global Wildlife Conservation about 2.5 years ago to head up their species program. So I oversee a fantastic program working to prevent the extinction and promote the recovery of critically endangered species across the world.
Wow. So you would say that you've been a hoofstock dork your whole life, like myself.
Well, it's interesting. Actually, my main interest is small carnivores and primates, but most of my work seems to be hoofstock. So I've become a hoofstock.
Okay, good. So it's like it's like a learned passion.
Yes, absolutely. No, we're working on the Saola, the Tamarau. We're trying to get work going on the endangered wild pigs and other wild cattle. I do a lot on the Indonesian rhinos, Sumatran and Javan. So yes, a lot of ungulates, which I never expected to be working on, really. But that's the way it goes, and I love them now.
They're fun, aren't they?
Absolutely. And we, one of my passions is working on species we know so little about and trying to learn about them and kind of that detective work of figuring out what it takes to conserve a species, which is a mixture of ecology, politics, culture, all of these kind of things. So putting all of those pieces together when we know so little is what really excites me, and to come up with workable conservation solutions as the outcome of that kind of detective work is fantastic fun.
Well, and I love how you describe it as detective work. In the podcast, a lot of times I always describe it from my travels abroad as very complex issues because, like you had mentioned, there's political issues, there's cultural things going on, plus a lot that we may not even know about the animal as far as their behavior, their ecology, the habitat range that they need. And so, yeah, I love your approach that's more of a detective work than complex, because complex makes it sound a little bit scary, which it is. It's definitely a lot to bite off, or a lot to chew, that's for sure. But I mean, I'm just so glad that there's people out there like yourselves that are willing to do this hard work, and the Organization of Global Wildlife Conservation. And what is the overall mission?
The mission of global wildlife conservation is to save the diversity of life on Earth. But we do that by focusing on wildlands, which are the most important, critically important sites on the planet, through wildlife, which is saving the most endangered species, and a Guardians program, which is building up the people that are going to be helping wildlife and wildlands. So yeah, we have a very clear mission and set of goals that we're working towards, trying to save the diversity of life on Earth.
And the Global Wildlife Conservation, or the GWC, we'll probably refer to it throughout the interview. They obviously are working on several projects with the Saola, but they have a host of other species projects in many different countries that they work on. Is that correct?
Absolutely, yes. We support groups around the world working on things ranging from wild cattle to small mammals to cave invertebrates. So yes, if a species is critically endangered and in need of a champion, we're willing to talk about helping to be that champion.
Wonderful. Oh, all right. This is amazing. Now, since we will be talking about the Saola, is that how you say it, or is it just my American accent that's my Midwestern accent?
Saola.
Saola.
Yes. It's actually two words, Sao and La,
Sao
in
La.
the local dialect in Vietnam and Laos. So yeah, Sao La.
Sao La. Okay, see? I love it. Learning. This is amazing. Can you briefly describe for our listeners, so they can get excited and become a Hoofstock dork like me, what it looks like, its size, its color, where it lives, what it eats, just some general things about it?
Sure. So it's a primitive bovidae, which means it's related to cows and goats. We don't exactly know what it's most closely related to, but it looks more like an antelope or the duiker of Africa. It's just under 1 meter tall and about 1.5 meters long. It's a chocolate brown and has long, tapering, straight horns, almost parallel, with just a very slight curve to them. And then it has these fantastic white markings on its face, around its nose and eyes. On its neck, it has a lovely kind of white crescent on its behind, and has little white socks as well. So it's an extremely beautiful and elegant looking animal. And if you can imagine this beautiful dark chocolate brown white animal in the dense multicolored green rainforests, it's a beautiful sight if I was to ever see it.
We'll get to that in a few questions. And now, where does it live?
Sure. So it's endemic to the Annamite Mountains, which means it's only found in one mountain range, which forms the border between Vietnam and Laos. And it actually is only found in the north and central part of that. So it spans about 1,000 kilometers from north to south, but probably only 40 to 50 kilometers east to west. So it's a very, very restricted range. And actually within that, it's only found in certain kind of microhabitats. So areas that are extremely wet, where they get monsoons coming from different directions during the year. So we call it ever wet forest, where it's basically always getting rain, whichever season it is. So it's not even found continuously across those mountain ranges. It's historically found in patches through that 1,000 kilometers.
Wow. And now, is this hoofstock animal, is it more of a grazer, so eating grass like we think of horses, or more of a browser, which is like a giraffe or black rhino, where they are reaching up and eating leaves in the trees?
We don't really know. I mean, it's more than likely a browser. You don't really get grass in rainforests.
Okay.
It's going to be walking along forested hillsides, plucking leaves as it goes.
Okay.
But we really don't know. There's been no ecological studies on the animal, so we really don't know what it eats. But it will be a browser.
Mm-hmm. And that kind of leads into my next question. If you could give the listeners a brief background on the history of the Saola? I'll get it, darn it.
The Saola.
Saola.
Sure.
Like when they were first recorded and their history with the locals. It's just an amazing story in my opinion.
Yeah, so we've actually found some archaeological facts which probably do have drawings of Saola on them. I don't know the exact date of them, but hundreds of years old. But to Western science, it was only discovered in 1992.
Right, when you read the article as a 15-year-old, right?
Absolutely, yes. So throughout the French colonial period, there was lots of discoveries in Vietnam and Laos, but they really didn't get up into the highlands. And then obviously there's been many decades of civil unrest in the area, which prevented exploration by Vietnamese and Lao scientists or Western scientists. So it was only really after the region kind of opened up that exploration started to go in. And in 1992, a joint expedition of WWF and FIPI, which is the Vietnamese Government Research Institute, went into an area called Vu Quang in north central Vietnam and found a pair of horns in a village. And instantly knew it was something new. And when it was published, it caused quite a stir around the world that such a large, beautiful, charismatic species was completely unknown to the Western world, or even the scientific world, until 1992. But that actually sparked a whole array of large mammal and bird and every other type of animal you can think of. There's been another ungulate discovered in the region. In 1997, the large antlered muntjac was found in the same area. And that is also critically endangered and not too far behind Saola in terms of closeness to extinction. Then there was the Annamite striped rabbit. There was something called the canu, which is an ancient form of, well, we thought that was a new species when it was described, but then we actually found it in historical records. So it's a living fossil. It's a small rodent that lives in the limestone areas of Laos and Vietnam. So this area has really opened up a treasure trove of new discoveries, and it really highlights what a vehicle for evolution the Annamite Mountains are. They've probably stayed wet throughout the recent history, warm and wet. So they've acted as a center of evolution within Southeast Asia. So there's all of these endemic species that have evolved out of there and radiated out of there as well. So it really is a special mountain range with incredible fauna and flora.
Then do researchers know a lot about Saola behavior or reproductive biology, or anything the locals can help you with, or not really?
No, I mean, we really do know so little about it. No scientist has ever seen one in the wild. There's been a few in captivity in the late 90s, early 2000s. Well, no, late 1990s. But they were all held in, not by professional keepers, with vets around. So none of them particularly lasted very long. So we've got very little idea. We've got indications that they are solitary, but maybe during breeding seasons, one or two of them, or three of them might get together. There's reports from local that they migrate, up and down the mountains in the seasons, but we have no idea if that's true or not. We do know they give one calf. We don't know how regularly, presumably one calf a year. But we really have no idea. Everything we're doing is from postmortems of dead animals or inference from what we know from the internal biology of the species, or from what locals are telling us. We really have very little idea. They have a huge preorbital flap with a musty substance underneath it on the cheek. So it's highly likely that they mark, the locals say they twist, they break saplings with their horns and then mark those broken saplings. But we don't know if that's territorial or what that is
reproductive,
about. Exactly. So we've got lots of guesses and ideas, but until one is actually studied, we know so little about this animal.
Wow. And now, with that being said, do you know what the estimated population of it is? Or obviously it's critically endangered, but is there a guess?
No. I mean, we've thrown numbers out before when pushed, but really we have no idea how many there are. What we do know is across their range, there's only a handful of sites where they remain.
So they're fragmented.
Yes. And within those sites, the experts believe none of those sites have more than 20 animals in. And again, that's a guess, but it's probably pretty close to accurate. So even if there's 5 or 6 sites with 20 animals in, which I don't believe there's that many, but if there is, none of those individual sites probably has a viable population over the long term. There's so few of them. We don't know if they're meeting each other and breeding. So we've probably got alley effects going on, which means inbreeding combined with just not having enough mating opportunities. So it's highly likely that every existing or remaining subpopulation is in an extinction vortex, and has no chance to recover. You layer on top of that the hunting pressure in each of these sites, where even if these populations were breeding, they're probably being killed at a faster rate than they're breeding. So every single population, even though we don't know how many there are, we can be 99.999% certain that every single subpopulation is going to go extinct very, very soon.
Well, yes. And can you elaborate on the hunting pressures? Are locals or indigenous people poaching them for their meat, or is it perhaps they're looking for other animals and then the Saola is just getting caught up in their traps? Or what is the exact pressure?
Sure. So the Annamite Mountains is an amazing hotbed of cultural diversity as well. So there's tens of different indigenous groups across the Annamites, all of which have their own cultural hunting practices and traditional hunting needs. I would say, though, however, about 20 years ago to 10 years ago, the need for those groups to hunt to sustain themselves has all but disappeared.
Okay.
Those groups are still often dependent on forest resources in times of crises. So if there's a crop failure for some reason or whatever, then they're still dependent on natural resources and need access to natural resources. But they don't really need to hunt for protein.
Okay.
So that has been, the governments and those groups have done a fantastic job of getting out of that absolute extreme dependence on hunting. However, about 20 years ago, as that traditional hunting was decreasing, new technologies came in that brought in snares. So snares were not used historically. They were using pitfall traps and bamboo spike spear traps and things like this. With snares coming in, and snares are made of bicycle brake cable, which is very, very cheap and you can buy in bulk. So what's happened is, although the traditional communities are not necessarily hunting so much, and they do still hunt partly for traditional reasons and cultural traditions, etc. But that's generally very targeted with spears or crossbows or something like that, because it's part of ceremony. So they can decide which species to hunt. The big threat now is lowlanders who are coming in and setting snares. And they're doing that to supply primarily the restaurant trade.
Yeah.
And in that part of the world, eating wildlife meat is seen as a status symbol. So if you are entertaining a superior at work, your business colleagues, a government partner, whatever, it's culturally significant to go out to eat wildlife rather than at any other type of restaurant. So there's a massive demand for wildlife meat, which is growing as Vietnam and Laos develop. There's a growing middle class, there's growing wealth, there's increased demand for that kind of thing. So what you're seeing now, and have been for like the last 10, 15, 20 years, is industrial scale snaring in these areas. And by industrial scale, I mean industrial scale. You will find a ridge path in a forest.
I was going to say that those are that's some heavy adjectives.
Yes. And I'm not exaggerating. If you find a ridge path, there will be a brush fence made from sticks and branches all the way up the ridge path. And every 5 meters, there'll be a hole with a snare on it.
Oh my gosh.
So any single animal, whether it's a ferret badger the size of a rat or a samba deer, which is larger than a white-tailed deer here in the US, any animal wanting to cross that ridge has to find a break in that brush fence and will be snared. So you're seeing total defaunation of these mountains. Wow. Complete empty forest syndrome, when you're seeing samba deer and lots of the civets, even porcupines, being completely wiped out of these forests. You're getting to a point where if you're walking through eastern US forest, you would not be seeing white-tailed deer. You would not be seeing
like really common
possums and raccoons.
Species
that
are least concerned. Their numbers are high. Those are being
absolutely. So when you're losing things like porcupines and samba, which are ubiquitous and relatively common under normal circumstances, you can imagine what it's like for a species like the Saola, which was probably always extremely rare and localized. And although they're not targeted, all the locals say their meat is not great, so they're not particularly targeted. Anything that crosses those ridge paths are being snared. So it's a bycatch type situation. Although, historically they were targeted by some groups, and the horns, people like to put their horns up in houses and things like that. But really the main threat is this industrial scale snaring to satisfy the restaurant meat trade. And to some degree, the traditional medicine trade, but really the species we're talking about are meat quarry species rather than medicine. Medicine is much more about pangolins and tortoises and things like that, which are caught in slightly different ways. So yeah, unfortunately, it's almost a bycatch situation, but it's this industrial scale snaring, which unless it's controlled, you're not just going to lose Saola, you're going to lose every single animal that walks on the ground.
Sounds like it's starting to already happen. And so obviously then there has been a critical need has been identified, and it's been around probably since the Saola was first discovered. And people like yourself, and then of course other groups, World Wildlife Fund, Global Wildlife Conservation, and others have stepped into the plate. And so I know that you have a couple different roles with your tenure with working with these critically endangered mammals. So if you could explain to listeners what you do both at the GWC, and then also I know you're a member, if not the head, of the Iucn Saola working group. If you could just give the listeners a quick little description of what you do as all of your multitude of roles, since you're so passionate about these little hoofstock guys, these mysterious unicorns. And then we'll talk a little bit more about what each different organization or I'm interested to know too what the local governments are doing to help protect these animals.
Sure, absolutely. So there's a group called the IUCN Species Survival Commission Asian Wild Cattle Specialist Group, and that is a group that is the world experts on all of the Asian wild cattle.
I know, I like them on Facebook. I follow them a lot. I suggest all the listeners do that. I will provide the link in our show notes.
It's a fantastic group. underneath that, there's a working group for Saola called the Saola Working Group, which I was the chair of. I'm not currently. It's a revolving chair. Currently, the chair of the cattle specialist group chairs the working group. And so that is a group of experts. It's about 30 people at the moment that are there as individuals. They don't represent their organizations. They represent individual expertise
independent
on the Saola.
council.
Yes. And that started off as very much an advisory group trying to understand the distribution, the threats, putting together action plans for both Vietnam and Laos. And that's been coordinated by someone called Bill Robichaud. Ever since it started. This is the guy that is the face of Saola conservation. He's been working on it ever since the discovery. He got to know Martha, which was the Saola that lasted the longest in captivity, and he studied Martha in Laos for a couple of months before, unfortunately, she passed away. And so Bill is the person that coordinates this group on the ground and really brings together the experts around the various different issues that are faced by Saola. So underneath that group, we have little task forces that are working on different issues. One is about how do we detect and find Saola?
Right.
Another one is how would we catch and move Saola to a breeding center and establishing a breeding center. Another one is how do we get political support for Saola conservation?
Huge one, yeah.
Another group is looking at how do we encourage the next generation of Saola conservation leaders from within Vietnam and Laos to emerge and blossom. So that working group is a group of experts that are trying to put together the best plan for saving the Saola and understanding the Saola ecology.
And so which working group are you participating in currently?
So
which section?
So I'm on the steering committee of that whole group.
That's a pretty big part.
Yeah, and I'm involved in a couple of the task forces underneath that. But my main role is helping kind of organize the group and work on the fundraising and awareness raising, so that we can bring in the international support to the work, because most of the people in the Saola working group are based, well, not most, but a big chunk of them are based in Vietnam and Laos doing the work on the ground.
Sure.
We have a lot of international expertise from the zoo community and NGOs that understand various parts of what would be needed for Saola conservation. And because I'm based in the US but know Vietnam and Laos very well, it's a useful role to me to play is helping push with their fundraising and awareness and bringing in expertise when needed and things like that. But really, it's a collective rather. We don't work as individuals. We don't work as individual task teams. It's a fantastic group of people that only have one mission, and that's to figure out how to save Saola and to make it happen. And what's happened in the last 3 to 4 years is we've really shifted from being a group of experts to being an implementation. But how do we turn this into action on the ground? So we're working with all the local conservation groups in Vietnam and Laos within Saola Range, and advising them on what they need to do. We're going in and doing certain things that need to be done in terms of research and surveys and things like that, but really working with these groups to try and protect the sites where Saola are found, and advising the government on what actions need to be taken. And we're working on establishing an MOU with the Vietnamese government and the Lao government to implement programs of conservation work for this species. So it's turned into a whole conservation program, and it's very multifaceted with individuals, with organizations on the ground in Vietnam and Laos, with the governments, with the international zoo community and the international conservation community, all pulling in the same direction. So it's complicated, but it's energizing, and we can certainly see progress happening day by day now.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, and now, Dr. Long, correct me if I'm wrong, but with the Iucn working groups, species working groups, this is all volunteer, correct?
It is.
Yes. Did you hear that, listeners? Let me repeat that one more time. The last 5 minutes he was talking or more about all the amazing work that, as well as 30 other individuals that are scientists, zoo specialists, conservation specialists, government specialists. They are doing this independent from whatever their job is, which probably isn't a highly paying job, just because in general, conservation isn't, you're not going to become a millionaire doing that. So independent of their normal job, which they're probably spread thin and working their behinds off to begin with, these working groups for the IUCN is all volunteer. So my hat goes off to you and all you listeners out there. Please pass this message along. Let people know about the great work that the IUCN is doing in general, but especially these working groups, which are these scientists and specialists that are volunteering a lot of time and a lot of energy and are, like Dr. Long said, making, not only discussing things, but actually implementing and making real action happen to help save the species, or in Dr. Long's case, it's the Saola. So thank you for that. I get goosebumps hearing about all that work because I know enough about the industry to know how much you do for your normal job. Then to add that on top of it, it's just you're a wildlife hero in my eyes, and hopefully in all the listeners.
Thank you. And that's what we've actually realized in the last couple of years, is that we can't save the Saola as volunteers. Mm-hmm. So we've actually been doing a lot of fundraising and outreach to ensure that there is a core group of people who are actually paid to establish and run this conservation program. So we are shifting over to a mechanism where there will be a team in Vietnam and Laos full time, running the conservation program.
Awesome.
But that still requires all of us volunteers to find that money to hire them.
Right. It just doesn't happen overnight. And then now what is the umbrella group that will be sponsoring that, or is that under Global Wildlife Conservation, or is it a different group, or is it completely an independent new group that'll be working towards on the ground species conservation and rescuing these Saola?
So we'll work through local organizations.
Okay.
So the coordination will be done through IUCN offices in the region, and then we work with both local NGOs and international NGOs, conservation groups in Vietnam and Laos. So anyone that's hired or grants are made will go through legal entities in the country. The bank account for the Saola Working Group sits at Global Wildlife Conservation, so we are their fiscal sponsor. We don't run the group. We just are their bank account, and we do that for free to enable the Saola Working Group to be able to have a bank account, and so we support them in that way. But it's run by the steering committee and the coordinator, Bill Robichaud, and all the decisions are made by the group as a whole.
Independently. And then now, so switching gears a little bit, moving to your work at the GWC, what are they doing for Saola conservation, or what programs are you overseeing there?
Sure. We do a lot of support primarily to the Saola Working Group itself. Okay. So my time is covered. I mean, we all work more than 100%.
More.
But my time is covered to help. We obviously provide the fiscal sponsorship at no charge, and we also cover all of their communications needs.
Oh, okay, that's a big one.
Free of charge. So our main role is actually supporting the Saola Working Group itself. We also provide funds to the Saola Working Group to be able to do some of the work, along with many other supporters of the group. And then GWC itself has a couple of projects in Vietnam and Laos where we're supporting more of the site-based protection side of things, and the research side of things, around snare removals and trying to address the threat of hunting. So we have, working through local partners are in Vietnam and Laos, supporting the conservation of those. Especially our biggest project is in Phu Mac National Park, where we're working with Fauna and Flora International and Vinh University and Save Vietnam's Wildlife to try and come up with a demonstration site on how we can prevent wildlife crime from occurring in the park. So that's an ongoing project that we have there, to try and prove that these parks can be snare free. It's going to be a long-term engagement. even if we get successful Saola conservation going, we're going to require reintroduction sites that are free of snaring. So although this is not 100% a Saola project, it's about Pumat and all the species within Pumat, but Saola is one of them. We want to have a demonstration site with no snares in the next 10 years. So if we have a successful conservation breeding program for Saola, we have somewhere to put them back. So we need to start now because it's going to take a decade to get that working. We can't wait for 10 years time and then suddenly start thinking about making sure there's no snares in the Annamites.
Gotcha. Yeah. And that leads to another question as far as the range, like you said, that they live in it's big, but it's fragmented. And so is it private land? Is it federal land? Are they in parks? Or is it all different throughout their range?
The vast majority of the fragmented populations are in parks. Both Vietnam and Laos have been fantastic at setting up parks wherever Saola are found. So the protection of the forest isn't necessarily a problem. There are still fewer little sites. There's one in Laos that we're working on at the moment. We're trying to establish a park around one of the small populations. And there's probably one or two small populations still in protection forest or ex-logging concessions, which are not really being logged, etc. But the vast majority of them are in parks. So that provides them some level of protection.
Right, but the poachers are still going in and putting snares.
Yes.
Illegally, I would assume.
Yes. So habitat loss is not a problem. There's more than enough habitat for Saola. That's not necessarily a problem.
It's such a unique problem because usually it's the other way around. It's more either habitat loss or human species conflict. And
yeah, in Southeast Asia, things are slightly different because the poaching pressure is so high. Even though there's been historically very large deforestation rates, the current issue is primarily hunting across Southeast Asia. So yeah, habitat is not a problem for Saola. We're losing beds and there's roads going through beds and there's hydropower dams being built. Yes, it's being eaten away from the edges, but it's not the main problem by a long shot. It's poaching, which is the problem. And yes, the parks have done a good job of stopping deforestation, but they have not been effective at preventing poaching yet. And
so is that potentially, besides, of course, getting the locals and the communities around potentially more active, but is it also a need for more rangers in the area?
Well, yes and no. Vietnam actually has a very good ranger system and probably has enough rangers. They do not focus on patrolling for snaring. The rangers in Vietnam are much more focused on illegal logging. So even though they possibly have enough rangers, you can always do with more rangers. They're not necessarily focused on the right issues around Saola conservation. Laos is different. Laos does not have enough rangers, and so we really could do with a significant increase in the ranger force in Laos, and again, not just more rangers, but better trained, better targeted, better managed rangers.
Of course, yes. And now I know historically this critter has been caught on camera traps, and there's pictures of it walking or going through the forest. Are there still camera traps being set, or have we seen one recently, or is that really not the best way to approach learning about this animal at this point in time?
So the first camera trap picture of a Saola was in 1998. And there was a slew around 98, 99. And there was a few pictures, but then there was a very long break before we got another picture. The last picture we got was in 2013. And interestingly, with that 2013 and the initial pictures, we got one set of images and then we never caught them again on cameras in the same location. So don't know what that means. The Saola could have
Mm-hmm.
been poached. It could have a
Sure.
very strange ecology that we don't know about, and it never comes back to the same place again. We really don't know.
Sure.
So for about 20 years, we've been trying to get adequate camera trapping going. And to be perfectly honest, we've never managed to do it because we've never had the funds available to really blanket camera trap an area. We've done lots of camera trapping studies with 20 or 30 camera traps. And that just hasn't produced results. What we've got going
Gotcha.
now is with this new big initiative that we're really pushing, through the Saola
Oh,
working group, is we actually have hundreds of camera traps out in a couple of locations. And they've been out,
oh, cool.
in some locations for a few months, and others are being put out at the moment. So we're hoping that by having finally, after 20 years of trying, significant numbers of camera traps in small locations where we believe Saola still exist, we're hoping that that will lead to detections, and not just individual detections, but repeat detections. So we can start
Sure.
understanding where they're living and what kind of terrain they're in, which parts of the forest they're inhabiting, which will help us not only get better at camera trapping, but will enable us to start targeting other conservation operations for them, primarily capturing and putting them in a conservation breeding program.
Well, and that leads into the next big question is, yeah, the future of Saola conservation. Getting better. What is the goal of the IUCN working group, or where do you see this going?
And so the work of the goal of the working group is to save Sal from extinction and have it recovered across its range. That's obviously a very long-term goal. Our immediate short-term goal is actually to catch as many Saola as we can find and put them into a conservation breeding program,
Okay.
which might sound drastic to some listeners, but it's a tried and tested method for conservation. If you look at things like the Californian condor, black-footed ferret, Arabian oryx, European bison, Przewalski's horse, these have all been saved because the last animals have been in captivity and they've been bred under human care, and they've eventually been released back into the wild. Because what I talked about earlier in terms of each population being too small, being impacted by alley effect, being in extinction vortices, we do not believe, as the collective set of world experts, that anywhere in the Saola range, the Saola can survive in the wild. Even though there's Saola there, even if they're breeding right now, they will not be there in 5 to 10 years' time. There's more deaths than there are births. And so we don't see any other option than to bring as many as of them we can find into captivity and breed them there, with the immediate aim of getting them reintroduced as soon as we've got a viable population in captivity and safe enough sites to reintroduce them to. The end goal is not to have a breeding program. The end goal is to get them in the wild across their range in safe places. But unfortunately, the first step to do that now is captive breeding. So it's drastic, but it really is the only option we've got. So we are now working with the international zoo community, which is where the expertise is in terms of capture, care, breeding, etc. And the international zoo community has been fantastic at
Oh,
funding and
yes.
providing technical support for this program.
Yeah, I was blessed enough in my career to be able to work with the Arabian oryx, which we haven't covered on the podcast yet, but that's up and coming, and their story is an amazing story. And I got to work with some at the zoo that were remnants of the breeding population that were then, of course, their cousins and whatnot had been re-released back in the wild and are doing good. Their numbers are stable and slightly increasing. So, and on the podcast, we've definitely covered the California condor and the black-footed ferret. And once again, it is, like you said, so much better to take action now before it's too late. I mean, for instance, the vaquita, most likely, the action to capture them and breed them under human care is probably too late, and they will most likely vanish in the next 5 years, if not sooner, due to their bycatch issue. So I applaud your work and all the experts, they know what they're doing. This has been a tried and true, proven method as a last resort, especially for these fragmented and over poached, like you said. How did you describe it? Industrial snaring. Oh my word. That's yes. And it doesn't matter how much governments or scientists throw their hearts and their hands into an action. If they can't compete with that, you have to remove the animal from that danger and get the numbers up so they could actually be more sustainable in the future. And then, of course, work towards implementing laws and more action in order to try to stop this. And hopefully, my goal is being an optimist, or my hope is being an optimist, is in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years that perhaps some of this goofy desire for wildlife meat and or wildlife medicinal, non-scientifically proven demand will decrease. And I don't know how that's going to happen, but hopefully with the next younger generation that aren't as tired as us or even us can get the people educated in knowing that wildlife, especially endangered wildlife, is not what you should be eating or taking as a medicine.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the Saola really is in the last second on that proverbial clock. And this is the last chance for the Saola. We have to find and catch them in the next few years. We really have no choice. We know they're still there. We know they're out in the forest. We just need to be able to find them and catch them. We probably are a few years too late. It would have been better be doing this 5 or 10 years ago. But that's just the way it is. As part of this program for the Saola, we are also actually rolling in the large antlered muntjac, which is the other large mammal that was discovered in 1997 in the Annamites. They're critically endangered and are a few years behind Saola. We still know 3 or 4 locations where there's viable populations, probably, although viable, we can never really define that. So as part of this program, we're also going to be capturing some large antlered muntjac when we know how to find them, and we know there's enough animals in the wild that we won't be hurting those wild populations by taking some out. So the Saola, even though the Saola is bycatch from the hunting point of view, large antlered muntjac is kind of bycatch from our Saola project that will actually establish a conservation breeding program for them at the same time. So we're getting a twofer out of this one as well.
A twofer, yes, a twofer hoofstock, critically endangered hoofstock. I love it. And now, so what is your answer to people that maybe say, oh, the money that's going to go into this, saving this endangered species or conserving it is a waste of time or a waste of money, I suppose?
Well, there's only certain things I can reply to that on air.
I was just saying, besides wanting to punch them in the face, like I do.
I get it. I mean, triage is something we have to deal with every single day. To me, there's a few different answers. One is ethical. I don't think it's humans' place on this planet to overtake it at the expense of every other living thing on the planet. And just from an ethical point of view, if we are causing that much harm, it's our responsibility to clean it up. So that's my own personal belief and why I'm in conservation. From a more kind of cultural point of view, the Saola is the flagship species of the Annamite Mountains. And, that would be a bit like China losing its pandas or the US losing its bald eagle. If we're willing to let the Saola go from the Annamites, we're willing to let everything else go. And so I see it as the crack in the dam. Well, we need to stop the crack here before the whole dam collapses. So the Saola to me is just an emblem of the Annamites, which is some of the best rainforest and most incredible place I've ever been in the world. And I'm lucky enough to travel the world quite extensively. And the Saola is such a beautiful species within that. I fear the domino effect if we lose the Saola.
And with that being said, too, sometimes these efforts can be pretty bleak to save some of these critically endangered species, or where poaching or trafficking is just horrific. You've been doing this for 20 years. What keeps you motivated to keep fighting this good fight each day with all your, not only for the Saola, but for all the other species that you work on and for the people? What helps keep you motivated?
I would say two things. One is the people that you work with. When you're surrounded by dedicated people, it's you kind of self-motivate each other.
Okay.
I mean, the Saola working group is a great example of people pulling in the same direction. I do a lot of work on Sumatran and Javan rhinos as well, and the teams in Indonesia that I work with there are just up against such difficult odds, but they're happy and jovial and just fantastic to work with. And so you kind of pull yourself along as a team and buck each other up as you go. The other thing that keeps me going is, as teams, you find solutions to problems. And like I started this conversation about it being kind of a detective work. Once you come up with solutions, you want to try them. And if a solution doesn't work, you try something else. I've been working in Vietnam for nearly 20 years, as I said. And, when I first went there, I was working on community-based conservation solutions to preventing poaching. I've worked on land tenure to indigenous communities. I've worked extensively with rangers on training and trying to get them better tactics and equipment. We then worked with community snare removal teams. I'm now working with criminologists from Michigan State University to try and understand how we can remove poaching and wildlife crime from community perspectives.
That Michigan State's my alma mater, so I gotta give
excellent.
them some props.
So, even though when you try one thing and you can see it has some impact, but it's not the full solution, you have to find the next piece of the puzzle. And, if you take all of those things I just mentioned for trying to prevent poaching, if you did all of them in one place, it might work.
Right.
But what's clearly not working is doing one of them in a site.
Gotcha.
So how do we bring all of that together? And to do that, you're going to have to work with numerous different partners because no one organization has all the skill sets that are required, all the funding that's required. So how do you pull everything together? And that's what we're trying to do in Pumat with this partnership I talked about, is finding a collaborative set of solutions to the problem. Again, we might not have all the answers yet, but let's get to a place where at least trying everything in the same place at the right scale that's required, because we might have all the answers. So to me, it's that detective work and trying, and yes, you might fail, but then you just push a little bit harder or from a slightly different direction. And it's that kind of figuring out the puzzle can be depressing, but it can also be really rewarding when you see the next piece of the puzzle fall into place.
Sure. Or if you're having a bad day and then you talk to one of your collaborators or team members and they pump you back up. So yeah, exactly. That's awesome. And so with that being said, how can the average person, our listeners, or somebody who's not able to be in Vietnam or Laos, how can they get involved to help conserve the Saola or other endangered ungulates in the area that you had mentioned?
Well, I think one of the issues we face with Saola is that no one knows about it, and no one knows how to pronounce it.
I knew I liked you. Good for you. Thank you.
So I think just spreading the word that there's these amazing creatures out there that no one's heard of. Tell people that they exist. Like, spread the word.
Right.
You've got no idea what telling one person will do. I mean, if BBC Wildlife hadn't published that article in 1992, I wouldn't be here.
Sure, you'd be like a banker somewhere or something,
well,
right?
Hopefully I'd still be in conservation somewhere, but I probably wouldn't be here talking about Saola.
Yeah.
So, you've got to tell people about them and get people to go on the websites and find these things out. The Saola Working Group has a website full of information. It's savesaola.org. So tell people. Also explain to people about the threats of eating wildlife and selling wildlife. I mean, the ultimate driver of so many extinctions in Southeast Asia, at least, and all over the world, but especially Southeast Asia, is the wildlife trade. And think about what you're doing, just the things you say about, posting pictures on Facebook of people eating wildlife, or buying the wrong fish from the fish store. I mean, make sure it's coming from a sustainable captive bred place rather than, if it's coming from the wild, make sure it's from a sustainably harvested place. How you buy your pets is critically important to driving or not driving the illegal trade in pets around the world. So just think about how you think about your consumption around species, and tell more and more people about it so they think about it before they're purchasing or before they're talking about things, or if they're going on holiday to Southeast Asia, that they don't go to places that are selling bear bile or eating weird wildlife and thinking it's cool and posting it on social media. So I think there's a lot people can do.
Yeah, I think that
just about the general issues.
Right. I really think that people in general can be endangered species ambassadors just through promoting education of these species and what to do and what not to do. You don't have to be a director of conservation, although that helps. You get more done that way. You don't have to be a person that hosts a podcast. You don't have to be a PhD in wildlife science. You just have to share information and the correct information and be passionate and get people. With Hoofstock, I know there's not always as seen as grandiose or perhaps as important as some of the other. Of course, I love rhinos, but rhinos get the megafauna, the elephants, the rhinos, the lions, tigers, and everything needs our help in this day and age. But definitely spreading the information of these lesser known animals, and we can just call it the mysterious Asian unicorn. Then that way I don't have to say it. Although I think I've got it now. It's Saola.
That's right.
Saola.
Excellent.
Okay. I'll just have to. I think if I write it up with a different way to pronounce it, I won't fall into my Latin style of pronunciation or my romantic language pronunciation. So yeah. So now, once again, can you go over some of the websites or links or Facebook groups for our listeners? And we'll post them to our show notes as well. But in case some people don't always go to the show notes, just so they have it logged into their brain.
Sure, absolutely. So the Saola Working Group's website is savethesaola.org, all one word. And there you can read up about what we do and how we're doing things and all the partners that are involved. And critically, there's also a donate button on there.
There it is. Yes, everybody listen. He's being shy and subtle about it. I'm not. Donate. These people are doing really good things, and you're gonna save this mysterious Asian unicorn from extinction, because they have a lot of models that we've learned from in the past of what works and what doesn't work. So even $1 will help, and if you can't afford $1, then definitely recirculate this information.
That's great. The Saola Working Group also has a Facebook page, so please get on there. We also send out a regular newsletter, so sign up to the newsletter and it'll come straight into your inbox. If you want to know more about the specific Saola work of global wildlife conservation, then please go to our website at globalwildlife.org. There you can find out more about the Saola Working Group as well as the GWC projects in Vietnam and Laos. And if you are on Instagram or Twitter, the Saola Working Group does not have those, but I do, and I post regularly about work in Southeast Asia and the work of the group. So follow me at Barny_Long on any of those outlets.
Wonderful. Well, Dr. Long, I thank you so much for talking to me openly and honestly, and of course passionately about the Saola. And hopefully our listeners are as excited about this little unicorn in Asia as I know that I am. And we need to help save this guy. Like you said, it's an ambassador species for the region, and it stands not only a lot for the local people, but just for in general. If we can't do this, geez, what can we do? And saving them will also, like you said, open doors for many other species that are in their same habitat. And now my last question for you is, I was wondering if you had any advice for students or people that are interested in careers in animal conservation?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, to me, the most important thing you can do if you're interested in it is get out there and get your boots dirty. It's very easy to send off emails left, right, and center asking for work experience, but there's nothing that replaces on the ground experience. I generally, when I'm hiring people, I'm not looking at how many degrees you've got. I'm looking at your references from people who have worked with you in the field. Can you work with politicians? Can you work with local communities? Can you work with scientists? Can you work with communicators? Are you a good fundraiser? These are the skills that you need, not so much the scientific skills. So I would focus on figuring out as broad a set of experiences as you can, and that's generally in the field, not in an office. Learn different languages, different cultures, travel around the world to as many different projects as you can get your foot in. That really is the best experience, not just for a conservation career, but also for life. So enjoy it. It's about experiencing this amazing world and the people and cultures around the world, as well as the wildlife. So dive in headfirst and don't give up, because so many people do. And those that make it are those that don't give up and are the most passionate.
Right, absolutely. And now, how would you say, of course, there's certain websites like aza.org that list jobs, and they have a lot of internships for maybe the younger person just trying to get their foot in the door. And that's more in a zoological setting. But how do you recommend, like if somebody wanted to work with us, they heard our interview and they're moved and they, just turned 19, they maybe just graduated with their undergraduate degree. Is it best to perhaps email a researcher working with a species, or do groups like GWC, do they do internships or anything like that?
It's very difficult to do internships and things in the field because of language barriers and visas and all of these kind of things. So it is difficult, and I fully understand how difficult it is. I did 9 months of volunteering in Indonesia as all through my undergrad degrees. I went to Indonesia every single summer as a volunteer, spent all my student loans on plane tickets and things like that. So
that's a good option, though. I studied abroad as well, so
yeah, it's difficult, and I understand it's difficult. How you get in the door, persistence.
Yeah, you just keep knocking.
Yeah,
you just keep knocking.
When I got accepted as a volunteer, I asked why they picked me over anybody else, and the response was, "You're the only one that didn't give up." And the people that are working with me, who approached me as students, are people that never gave up and eventually got out to the field and proved themselves when they were there. So it really is about persistence. You can send, these day and age, you can send 1,000 emails a day to people all over the world at various conservation projects. They're all receiving lots of emails with similar requests. What do you have that those other 100 people a day are not and don't have?
Correct.
It's passion, persistence, willingness to go out and do things. Whereas roadblocks are things to be broken down, not things to give up because of.
I love it, Dr. Long. You're a very wise soul. So,
not sure about that.
but definitely traveling too. I did a lot of traveling after my undergraduate degrees to Central, South America, Africa, and it definitely was very, very eye-opening to obviously a lot of wildlife and crises that were happening over there, but also to cultural. And it gave me a lot more sensitivity and I think compassion into the complexity, or like you said, detective skills or puzzle pieces, that it's not a one-stop shop solution. And so therefore, for me, it just made me want to learn more and how to methodically put all the pieces together, or start to, and also too, what am I good at? What can I do? What would I fit into? Not everybody can be a forensic scientist. Not everybody can be a politician. But I can have my one part that I specialize in, but then work on all the other ones. Work on my other.
Absolutely. I think that's a really, really important point. I mean, I went out to the rainforest wanting to be an ecologist, radio tracking animals and things like that. I very quickly realized that although I love being in the rainforest, I was not the best scientist out there. I didn't want to spend my whole life working on data and numbers. I was much better with people and connecting, collaborations and that kind of thing. So absolutely, don't go out there also too preconceived as to what you want to do, because you don't know until you get out there whether you'll enjoy the conditions, whether you'll be able to learn languages, whether you're great at fundraising or communications or science or whatever. So yeah, get out there, try different things. Don't be afraid to fail, and don't be afraid to change direction.
Exactly. I always say, keep knocking on the door, but make sure you're knocking on multiple doors.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yes. Well, Dr. Long, once again, thank you for your time and getting us all excited about Saola conservation. And if you are ever hiring somebody that fits a lot of pieces of the puzzle, you know where to find me. We're now Facebook friends, so keep me in mind. Unfortunately, with my two...
Oh, I can't stop this podcast.
I know, right? But unfortunately, because of my two little ones, my 4-year-old and 2-year-old, I can't have boots on the ground at this point in time. But of course, there is in the future. That'll be my retirement. It'll definitely be boots on the ground somewhere, doing something in the jungles and saving more animals. That's for sure. So, thank you so much, and we'll put all your notes and websites up on our show notes for our listeners and everybody. If you made it through this whole interview, which hopefully you did, your number one job today is to tell somebody or share something on social media about the Saola and its conservation crisis. So please share. And Dr. Long, we'll stay in touch, and I really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.